A massive blast tore up the border area of the Syrian town of Kobani as a US-led coalition launched yet more airstrikes against Islamic State fighters. The latest airstrikes come as a leader from the Syrian opposition said his side was winning in the battle for control of the city. The situation on the ground makes it near impossible to verify the claims of victory made by parties on the ground. Kobani, on the border with Turkey, has been encircled by Islamic State fighters for more than 40 days. Weeks of US-led airstrikes have failed to break their stranglehold, and Kurds are hoping the arrival of Peshmerga will turn the tide. The UN Peace Envoy Staffan de Mistura has presented an action plan for Syria, proposing to freeze fighting in local areas to allow for aid deliveries and to lay the groundwork for talks. His comments were made amid a worsening situation on the ground, in which all parties to the war show callous disregard for millions of suffering civilians, according to the UN. Staffan de Mistura briefed the Council following his 40-day-long tour in the region. The action plan includes implementing some incremental freeze zones, local ceasefires, where political process could be started at a local level. He mentioned the city of Aleppo, a place of iconic value, as an obvious candidate.
Proposing and seeing whether we can implement some freeze zones or incremental freeze zones in order to make sure that in those areas we will be able then to build first some political process at a local level and then eventually a national level, give some hope to the local population and avoid that the fight which is going on at the moment is actually producing an advantage to Daesh.
With me to talk about Syria is Mohamed Najjar from the Syrian Parliamentary Affairs Group. Mohamed, welcome to the programme. We saw the UN Peace Envoy there in that clip talking about the creation of some safe areas. Is that possible?
Well, actually, this is seen as an attempt, another attempt to bring the Syrian regime, Bashar al-Assad, into the international arena, into the international family again. This comes amid the difficulty, the coalition against the Islamic State, which hasn't actually brought any significant success in facing this organization. I don't think this is a practical thing to do, because this has been tried before. Mr. Mistura is enforcing an ill thought which has been tried before by Kofi Annan and the other envoys to Syria. And also it is seen.
Possible, but why don't you think it's possible?
Because the Syrian regime has been tried several times. We have seen some agreements brokered by the previous envoys. And the Syrian regime didn't keep these agreements. He always violated these agreements. He's always done everything apart from the agreement itself. Some people see that as also an attempt to bring some ally, a local ally, to face the Islamic State, as they have so far didn't. They failed basically in fighting the Islamic State.
What does it look like on the ground now? I mean, you say the offensive against the Islamic State's failing. Is the Assad regime benefiting from that?
Well, that is quite obvious to everyone, especially to the Americans themselves. Mr. Hagel, the American defense minister, stated that clearly and said the Assad may have benefited or may benefit from the attacks on the aerial attacks on the Islamic State. Well, this is probably a reason why they want Bashar al-Assad to come back. They want to bring another ally, because they probably need in down the line to bring some foots on the ground, and they won't find somebody better than Bashar al-Assad. This has always been the excuse.
There must be already covert coordination between the Assad regime and the Americans, because, as we know, one of the things that the Americans have always been worried about is that the Assad regime does have serious anti-aircraft weaponry, which could bring down the planes that are now bombing ISIS. The fact that they're not being brought down must mean that that's been agreed with Assad. Is that your view?
Well, there has been many reports about coordination between the Americans and the Assad regime. Many of his officials stated that clearly on the screens, saying that the Americans have talked to us and we have agreed to be a part of the coalition. And that is actually comes in a very critical stage for the Assad regime that has been begging for a role to play within the coalition against terrorism. And he wants to be seen as an active player. Especially Mr. Mistura himself, when he said that after talking to Bashar al-Assad, he encouraged him to back a peace process to show that he is serious about fighting terrorism. So this is the scenario that has been, talked about for several months now. And the Western powers have been talking to Assad, despite the fact that the Americans denied talking to Bashar al-Assad, and despite the fact that they have made contradicting statements. Maybe a couple of days ago, a senior American official said that Assad still, despite the fact he might be benefiting from our aerial strikes on Islamic State, but we still oppose him to stay in power. He has to step down.
And what is the situation now for ordinary Syrians? I mean, it looks to most people observing the situation as if it must be a totally unworkable society. The Assad regime controls a certain section of society, ISIS controls another. There's the battle that we know in the north around the Kurdistan and whatnot. Is there any semblance of the revolution that kicked off the events way back in 2011? Well, actually,
what I could say about that is that the situation is chaos. The Syrian people have been abandoned. The country practically is several parts. As you have mentioned, the regime is in the northwestern part of Syria, especially Damascus and the coastal areas, with Hama and Homs, parts of Homs, especially the city. The Free Syrian Army is in control of the north with Jabhat al-Nusra. The ISIS, or the Islamic State, they control the eastern part with the oil, fields and a huge part of Syria is basically under the control of ISIS. The situation is quite bad. On the humanitarian basis, there is no enough supplies getting into inside Syria, and this has been stated clearly also by one of the UN officials. Despite the authority that has been given by the UN to pass these aids into inside Syria without the approval of the Syrian regime. The bombardment of the oil fields in the eastern part of Syria is going to cause a lot of harm to the Syrian people that are still inside Syria, and they will suffer badly this winter because they won't have any kind of fuel or anything to warm their people.
What's the situation like there? It was mentioned specifically by the UN peace envoy there.
Well, the Syrian regime forces are trying to circulate Aleppo and block all types of aid coming inside the city. The Free Syrian Army managed to stop the militias of Hezbollah and Abu al-Fadl Abbas, basically that are loyal to Bashar al-Assad. They managed to block the Syrian regime from besieging the city of Aleppo. The city itself is taking into halves between the Syrian regime and the Free Syrian Army, and some parts are under the control of Jabhat al-Nusra, especially in the eastern part of Aleppo, where the fierce fighting is taking place. It's especially in the area where Mustashfa, or the hospital Kindi, and Handarat, the Palestinian refugee camp. So this is the situation. Very little is getting into the city of Aleppo. The NHS, or the National Health Service, has collapsed. Only few doctors are left. Only few medical staff are left in a city that populates like 4 to 5 million people. And I think about half of the population of Aleppo has left already. Those areas that are under the regime control, they enjoy a little bit of peace compared to the areas that are under the opposition forces that receive all the aerial bombardment, barrel bombs, gas attacks, all types of attacks by the Syrian regime.
Well, what do you make now? I mean, we've discussed the fact that we can argue about the degree of conscious coordination, but even if you think it's a kind of unintended product of the bombing, the Assad regime gaining ground or gaining support from that, in that context, how realistically do people on the ground take the American talk of arming the moderates, as they describe it?
Well, unfortunately, there is no trust. It's always the people always look at the Americans as collaborators with the Assad regime. Their real intention is to keep Assad in power. They did not actually aid the Syrian people or support them with any kind of significant, substantive support, basically, especially on the humanitarian level. Syrian people, especially the injured and those who have been displaced, they got help only from the Turks. The Turks just stated that they have spent over $4 to $5 billion on the refugees, on the Syrian refugees, and I think the number has reached probably 2 million in Turkey. This is the best place for the Syrian people, and that is the only country that has given significant help to the Syrian people. So going back to the way Syrian people look at the Americans, they have always had doubts about whatever the Americans say, and when they say something that is exciting, it doesn't really translate it into action on the ground. They don't see really anything. They have been promised several times, especially about weapons and about political aid, about training the Free Syrian Army, but so far hasn't translated.
Okay, well, on that note, I'm afraid we're going to have to stop. Now, Burma's political and ethnic leaders have agreed to work together.